I want to start this week's podcast off with a story. Years ago, one night after work, as we were getting ready to start a meeting, one of our senior executives asked me what I had thought about a Discovery Channel series that had aired the night before on evolution, probably knowing that he could evoke an entertaining response out of me. I told him I thought the episode was interesting, but it was long on conclusions and short on evidence. And one of my coworkers looked at me just stunned and said, "Really, you don't believe in evolution?" And I told her, I said, I think there's a lot of problems with the theory, but before we could go any further, the meeting started and we never really got to finish the discussion. I want to dedicate this episode and the series we're about to start to her and everybody out there who's looking for answers to these difficult questions. You know, back in the first episode, I said that this was going to be a podcast for people who were skeptics, people who were just searching for answers, or people who were Christians who were just really trying to answer a few difficult questions. And this topic of were we created or are we just a great cosmic accident tends to be one of those things that generates a lot of confusion and a lot of questions out there. The reason why is for the last 160 years, we've been told in varying forms that this is settled science, that science has figured out how we got here, that Darwin's theory of natural selection or evolution, whichever you want to call it, had paved the way and we've explained existence without needing to refer to God. And I've been amazed over the years at how inaccurate those ideas really are. This narrative of evolution has just become something that's too big to be questioned, and we never really roll up our sleeves and examine it anymore. Very few people actually go back and read Darwin's book, The Origin of Species. And when you do, it's a real eye-opener, and not in the way many naturalists would think of today. I was amazed as I've studied this material, looking back on the things that I was taught in high school a million years ago back in the 1980s, how many things I was taught that were absolutely disproven and untrue. Things like Darwin's Tree of Life, or Stanley Miller's experiment, or Haeckel's embryos. All of those things that are truly the icons of atheism and agnosticism, and more specifically in this case, the icons of natural selection and evolution, those things have been disproven as good examples of Darwin's theory or any naturalistic theory, in some cases 100 years ago. And yet there they were in my textbook in the 1980s, and I was stunned of all the things that I was taught were settled science that turned out to be untrue, and I think you're going to be stunned as well. I can't wait to get this series started. Let's jump into this together and see what we find. Welcome back to the Seeking Proof, Finding Grace podcast. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to encourage you with the single most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Now, we're going to start tearing into this week the question of were we created or are we just a great cosmic accident? And as we do so, I want to introduce the topic of where the science has actually taken us in the last 100 years. You know, there are so many topics out there that I think a lot of us hear of in our daily lives. Topics like the Big Bang Theory, or Einstein's general theory of relativity, or quantum mechanics, or things like that. And I think somehow it's been programmed into us over the years that all of these ideas somehow disprove the idea of God. That with every major scientific discovery, we're walking further and further and further away from the idea of God. And certainly that's the philosophical picture that's painted for us by certain members of the scientific community. But is that really true? Has the discovery of the concept of the Big Bang, has that actually brought us closer to God, or has it brought us further away from God? Has it explained creation and everything that we see around us? You notice I used the word creation, that wasn't entirely accidental. Has it explained everything that we see around us? Or has it actually opened up the question of where did we come from even more? Certainly if scientific theories and discoveries over the last 100 years are bringing us closer and closer to proving that there is a God, we've been told that, right? Wouldn't we? But what if we haven't? What if the scientific discoveries over the last 100 years have absolutely shaken Darwinian theory to its very core? And that's actually what's happened. Things like cellular biology and the discoveries that we've made in them, DNA and the evidence that's coded into us and in everything that we see around us, cosmology and physics, the discoveries that have been made in the last 100 years point the finger directly to God. But that's going to be the question. And that's my interpretation, certainly, of the facts. What we've got to look at is two distinct narratives that we've been caught up in all of this. You know, all the way back in episode 2, I introduced you to God through his own words in the story of the prodigal son. This week, I want to introduce you to two gods. And certainly there's the one that we've been talking about, God with a capital G, the idea of a creator God who loved us so very much that he created everything that we see around us and us so that there would be an opportunity for him to have a relationship with us, first here and then in all eternity. So that's the idea of God with a big G. And then there's the second God, God with a little g. We're going to find along this journey that there is a natural tendency to try to sneak into the discussion intelligence or guidance where it shouldn't be. The problem with Darwin's theory is going to be beginnings. The problems with any naturalistic theory is beginnings. Getting anything off the ground is incredibly difficult to do without any guidance whatsoever. And you're going to find a need on the half of scientists philosophically who identify as naturalist, agnostic, or atheistic to try to sneak into the equation some sort of guiding hand of intelligence because the process doesn't get there on its own. Darwin's theory required this process to be unguided, slow-moving, and that these things would happen on their own. That through natural selection, we would just simply reach this point. The problem is it doesn't really work terribly well on its own, and you're going to find over and over again throughout these theories the insertion of another God. Some scientists will call it the universe. Some scientists are going to refer to it as luck over and over and over again, that luck intervenes, and it's more luck than could build the city of Las Vegas. But over and over again, you're going to find this need to sneak that in. And lest you think I'm exaggerating, from Charles Darwin's book, Origin of Species, clear back in 1859, it has been said that I speak of natural selection as an active power or deity. But who objects to an author speaking of the attraction of gravity as ruling the movements of the planets? Okay, those people who criticized Darwin for that were exactly right. And when you read through his book, you do notice the fact that he tends to attribute godlike powers to natural selection. And we're going to look at quotes along the way that show exactly that. What we tend to find in this process as these two great theories struggle with each other, and this is where we're caught up in the middle of them, which one of these two theories is right? Which one of these two theories provides the best answer for what we see today? Is it the idea that everything that we see around us shows the complexity and the design of intelligence? That we see the handiwork of an intelligent creator in everything that we see around us, and we see clear evidence of his presence? Or are we simply the product of time, matter, and luck? And that's going to be the fundamental question as we go forward. I think it's important in all of this that we choose one or the other. I don't like this idea, and we're not going to go down this path of, well, maybe a creator got it started and then walked away. And that feels to me like, well, I was hoping for God, but I really couldn't find enough evidence, so I'm just going to kind of sneak God in on the side, and then I'm going to walk away from it. We're not going to do that. But at the same time, what we're also not going to do is just allow copious amounts of luck to rule the day at every step of the way. We're going to talk about this idea of God of the gaps a little further down the road, and that's this temptation to let God sneak in and fill every gap that we possibly can whenever we have a hole in our understanding with God. Whether that's a big G or a little g, we're not going to do that. But what we have to do is answer that question as we move forward. I also want to deal with this idea that there's animosity that somehow exists between science and religion. And there's no question there may be some animosity that exists between the two. But that's more philosophical than it has anything to do with the science. From my perspective as a Christian, science has brought us closer to God in the last 100 years than we ever imagined possible. And I know I said that before, and I'm probably going to say it a lot more times as we go forward. The scientific discoveries of the last 100 years, as I look at them, have brought us a greater understanding of how God created us and what he did, and the amazing wonder of how incredibly well designed this universe is and how incredibly well designed we are, science has brought us closer to God than ever before. So from my perspective, there is no animosity between the two. Philosophically, you'll find an enormous amount of animosity between creationists, people who believe that we were created, and naturalists, people who believe that we're here as a result of random chance, time, and matter. It's the philosophical difference between the two that's the real issue. I love this quote from Lewis and Barnes in their book, A Fortunate Universe. It says, naturalism, in contrast, is not agnostic. Rather, it is the claim that there is nothing that explains the ultimate laws of nature. Theism's rival is naturalism, not science. And theism offers an explanation where naturalism offers none. If naturalism turns out to be more likely than theism, it will be because theism unwisely tried to explain the unexplainable, not because naturalism offered a better or indeed any explanation of the ultimate laws of nature, and certainly not because of any scientific theory. When you really think about it, the point that they're making is absolutely true. Naturalism basically puts on the table the idea that we are the product of time, chance, and matter. That somehow a couple of molecules bumped together and that began this great process that ultimately ended up with us. And the amount of luck that has to be attributed in all of this is enormous. It's more than you can ever imagine. And we're going to unpack that a lot as we go forward. But theism, as they refer to it, or creationism's natural enemy is not science. And don't make the mistake of falling into that camp. You can absolutely be a Christian or a religious person and still be full on board with scientific discovery. Amazingly enough, what we're going to see as we move forward in this process is that Christians and religious people are the ones who are pointing the finger at the most current science on the table and demanding that we update naturalistic theories that are 160 years old. Darwin's theories that were developed before the Civil War, before we had indoor plumbing or the Model T car, are in dire need of an update, and the time has come to do so. But how do we do that? And that's maybe the million-dollar question on the table. How do we prove one or the other? And the answer, I'm convinced, is in the journey. This is not a question that can be answered in one single step. There is no silver bullet. There is no one thing that anyone can put on the table that I think would convince the other side in this question. I'm fairly convinced if God showed up in Times Square and suddenly announced his presence, kind of like what we talked about a couple of episodes ago of why there has to be a little bit of faith and why God won't just show up. But let's say God did show up in Times Square and announce, I am God, I created you. I'm pretty sure there's going to be a hardcore group of naturalists out there who are going to say, still don't believe it. Still don't believe that that's really God. Still don't believe that's how I got here. There is no one single silver bullet that's going to prove it to either side. If you could definitively prove that the earth was billions of years old, does that disprove Christianity or disprove God? Absolutely not. Then we'll talk about the age of the earth down the road as we look at this. There is no one thing, but what we need to look at is a comprehensive roadmap, you might say, of how we got here. We need to look at a comprehensive picture from nothing to where everything began to where we are today. That's where you're going to find the answer to this. And the mistake I think a lot of people make is to take one little nugget of truth, one piece of scientific discovery, and say this single piece of scientific discovery absolutely proves, well, my point. There's no truth in that. It's going to be the cumulative journey that actually answers the question for us. Were we created, or are we simply the result of time, matter, and luck? That's going to be the question. There are going to be things that I say that make naturalists angry, and I understand that, and I'm not trying to make anybody angry. I want us to take this journey together, and I want us to have good respect for each other as we work along the way. But at the same time, there are things that we're all going to have to admit as we move forward in this process. I quoted before Darwin's quote that people criticized him 160 years ago, that he spoke of natural selection in godlike form. There is that tendency to have to sneak a designer into this process from the naturalistic side of things. And I'm going to put evidence on the table accordingly to back that claim up. But you have to remember as we go forward, too much luck is a bad thing, and we're not going to lean on that either. So as we go forward, I'm going to put evidence on the table to support the claims I'm making. I'm going to try to also reference really good sources. The dangerous thing of believing anything that you see on the internet is whether or not it's been well sourced. And trust me, I understand the irony. That's something I said that's now on the internet. I'm going to try to give you good sources to look at as we go forward on this. As I mentioned, one of the best sources I think in any of this, Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, written in 1859. I think it's a fantastic read. I wish more people read it, because reading it with a critical eye and reading Darwin's responses to his critics, I think in doing so you see, Darwin painted a fantastic picture. My goodness, he was an amazing storyteller. But when you actually critically look at how he tells his stories, the pictures that he paints, far too often Darwin conveniently just assumes, well, we're going to skip the beginning and jump right into the middle, and from the middle he's going to move forward. But we've all got to take a critical look at this, and that's why we're going to do this in the form of a journey. We're going to start off with nothing and we're going to move forward. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to take care of a couple of issues of housekeeping, and we're going to look at a couple of things that we all need to make sure that we're not guilty of doing. We're going to look at this question of God of the gaps and how do we avoid that. We're also going to look at the question of how old is the earth and the universe, and really, does that matter as we look at this going forward? I think it's going to be important to answer that question, especially for Christians as we go forward in this topic. But as we look at that for the next few weeks, stick with me as we take this journey. I think you're going to find it exciting, and I think you'll be amazed at all of the things that maybe you were never told. Things like me, when I finally found out that Darwin's tree of life doesn't look anything like what he thought it looked like. The archaeological evidence absolutely does not support his theory. And that's kind of critical for Darwin's theory as we go forward. So as we do this, I can't wait to take this journey with you. Thank you so much for joining us this week on Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. As always, you can find us at prooftograce.com. If you have questions, please reach out to us at prooftograce@yahoo.com. You can find our podcasts on Apple, iTunes, and Spotify, and of course here on our YouTube channel. Love it if you would hit that like and subscribe button, or if you'd follow us on our podcasts. Thank you so much for joining us this week, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks again. Bye-bye.